Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, I'll be continuing the Stormlight reread series I started with my video on the Prelude by discussing the Way of Kings first book in the Stormlight Archive in full. Typically with branded Sanderson Stormlight Archive, I like to reread the previous books prior to the next book in this series coming out to just make sure it's all fresh in my mind because there is so much going on in this series, and with Rhythm of War coming out very soon, it's once again time for that reread. So in this video I'll be doing something a little different, and instead of reviewing the book, I'll be discussing the events of the book chronologically and pointing out things that I liked and the meaning behind a lot of what happens to the greater story as well. Since I'll be doing one of these videos for each of the other current entries, including the Edge Dancer novella, I'm going to keep this video spoiler-free in regards to the later entries, but of course I'll be discussing Way of Kings from beginning to end, so there will be spoilers for everything and anything that happens in this first book. As a final note, this video is intended more so for those who have already read the book, so I won't be detailing the really basic parts of the premise, light eyes versus dark eyes, things like that, but really focusing more on summarizing the big events and talking about those things, or the things that I thought really had a big impact on me when I was reading as well. I, of course, will not be able to talk through even close to everything, given just the huge scope of these novels, but this will give you a really general review of what happens in this book and let you know my thoughts while I reread Way of Kings. With that, I'm going to jump into the prologue, where we first meet Seth, and we see him dressed in white to kill a king, of course, the great opening line, and we see right away glimpses into the magic system in Stormlight Archive, where he summons a shard blade, he's able to surge bind, and I love the way that Sanderson uses an action-heavy scene to explain the basic lashings involved with Seth's surge binding as well. Of course, the scene ends with King Gavilar being successfully assassinated by Seth, and this is really the call to action for the events surrounding many of the characters. It sends the Alethi to the Shattered Plains to enact vengeance on the Parshendi, who claimed credit for the assassination, despite the treaty they had just agreed to. Next, we meet Kaladin, and he's really the main focus of the book for the most part. Well, of course, there are other main characters. This is Kaladin's book, and he really has a complete arc between the main storyline and the flashback sequences. The way he's introduced is this young squad leader. He's loved by his men. He's deemed to be storm-blessed, very, very lucky, and always he's trying to protect the younger ones, the young boys who are drafted into the army and don't really know how to fight and are in a lot of danger. And we see this really big high point for him. He's very triumphant, and then immediately drop off a cliff and just drop way, way low to all of a sudden he's a slave. And while that's a pretty jarring transition, it really sets up the other high and low points to his story fantastically, and I loved that as a device for the first introduction to Kaladin. The next main character we meet is Shallan, and she is described as a very smart, young, light-eyed woman, and one that, due to her family troubles, which we don't find a ton about right off the bat, is trying to save her family the only way she can think of to do so, becoming the ward of the renowned scholar and heretic Yasna Kholin, and stealing her soulcaster, as her father, before his death, had one, and used it to create mineral deposits for wealth. Now, all of this, I will admit right away, the first read-through I did not really care for Shallan's plot lines as much, and that even held the second one leading up to Words of Radiance. Shallan is a character that gets developed so much more and so well in the later books, and so I've come to really, really appreciate things that happen in the first book. So if you're like me and kind of thought the same thing, it does get so much better. But after seeing more of the development happen later on as well, you do start to see the base idea of what was being set up in Way of Kings in general, and it's still, the plot line, I think, it has some flaws. The whole just general idea is kind of a little far-fetched for me, but really after digging more into her past, everything that was going on in Words of Radiance, it just gets a lot more enjoyable with her parts as well. Moving back to Kaladin, his main plot point arises with him being placed into Bridge 4. He already is depressed, he thinks he just can't sink any lower, but becoming a bridgeman challenges that thought, and the slow build of him truly discovering just how hopeless the lives of the bridgemen are is something that really, really throughout the story allows us to delve deeper into his mind and understand why he feels the way that he does. We also meet Syl for the first time, who at first seems to be just more of a sentient windspren, but who of course becomes vastly more important later in the story. And here and throughout, though I think Sanderson does a great job of using Syl to lighten the dark tone of many of Kaladin's experiences and his plot lines in general. I know Sanderson isn't a huge fan of having things be overly dark, so having a little bit of lightness here, and there's some other humor that's put into Bridge 4's time as well between some of the characters and some banter. I think that really helps to bring up so that it's not just dark and dreary the whole time, so I did enjoy that it was done that way. At this point in general, I do want to note just how plain alien the world of Roshar is. A lot of the other worlds Sanderson creates were something we'd seen before, something we could understand what was going on, but this is a world that's really completely different from our own in so many ways. We see crustaceans are the main life form besides humans, and most of the landscape is barren because it's destroyed by the high storms. Plants just retract into the ground and only come out after high storms to get the rain and get the water, and it's really all life on Roshar completely subject to the whims of the high storms. Cities are built to protect from high storms. Everything involves these horribly violent storms that just come as a normal part of the weather. And it's really interesting seeing this normally probably would be cataclysmic event just be the norm and something everybody's used to and prepares for in this world. And you can tell right away that this is going to be a very unique world, and that we're going to dive so much deeper into this world than we have to a lot of other worlds that Sanderson has created. Finally, as part 1 is coming to an end, we see Kaladin kind of starting to be a leader once again. He'd been really low, and we're starting to see him rise up again, which is kind of a theme with him. And we're left with this decisive feeling that he has turned over a new leaf, and that there is still hope. We move then to the interludes, and interludes in general are not exactly a normal device that you would see in fantasy or really in fiction in general, but it's something that Sanderson uses masterfully to not only accomplish just a massive amount of world building in a short time, but also to tell other side plots without feeling like it's interrupting the main plot, which is something you can have a problem with a lot of series that try to do little side plots going in. So first, we see Ishik and learn about the Pure Lake and its very unique ecosystem and religious belief structure. And for those that do pay more attention to the Cosmere as a whole, we also get our first look at the world hoppers who are here on Roshar, and looking for who's later to be revealed as Hoid. Of course, it's Hoid, who else would it be? And this is just fantastically done, because if you aren't aware of the bigger picture, this is still a really well-written world-building passage, but if you are, you get that something extra out of it as well. Next, we have Inad Ballet, one of Shallan's brothers, and this passage does offer some world building as well. It explains him raising axe hounds, what those are. We see some crab-like creatures, but really the bigger thing it does is show a little bit of the darkness that involves Shallan's family, and just kind of start to hint at the deeper story, because we're not going to get the full story, so this is a nice way of putting that in, doing some world building, and just giving Shallan a little bit more backstory in the meantime as well. Finally, we return to Seth, who many of us were patiently waiting to see again, and we get a little more information on him, although still not a lot. He's left, I think, very intentionally to be very mysterious as a character, and we're not finding a ton about him, but we see him changing hands due to his Oathstone, understand that he does follow whoever hasn't, unquestioningly, except to take his own life or to give up his Shardblade, of course. So to start part 2, we meet High Prince Dalinar and his son Adolin, and these are the final 2 main characters that are going to be introduced for the most part in this first book, Way of Kings. And we first see Dalinar through the lens of his son Adolin, who does look up to his father and knows that he's previously been great, but kind of sees him the way we find out a lot of people see him, as a bit washed up. Feel like he's become weaker, and we get only flashes of his past glories, and a lot of it is just him kind of simmering down. And so between that, and then once we actually see Dalinar himself and his questions of himself, we kind of wonder who really is this character. Adolin does seem a little bit, of a spoiled and immature young man who's the son of a high prince, and that's kind of who he is. We get to see more growth here, but Dalinar, right off the bat, you're not really able to tell what kind of character he is going to be. And he questions himself, and we also get some outside perspectives that are completely different from Kaladin's fellow Bridgemen, who often will comment that, well, Dalinar is supposed to be very honorable. He doesn't use bridgemen. There's all of these other sides, so we get so many differing perspectives, and that plays really well into what was being developed with Dalinar here and what is developed much more later on as well. Sanderson does really have to walk a fine line with how he develops the characters in this book and these books in general, when he knows they will each have their own book with the flashback sequences at a later time. So he has to make sure he gives us enough to keep them interesting, but not too much that it's no surprise when we get to their actual backstory. And I think he does a really great job doing this. He gives bigger hints and a little bit more in the past of characters like Dalinar and Shallan, who are not getting their books until later. And with Kaladin, he keeps it really on a tight leash for what we find out, because that's kind of the main arc we're following, and so he doesn't want to reveal too much about Kaladin until it is time for those kind of big crescendos. So with that, we do go to Kaladin for more of his flashbacks, and the theme really is him trying to find out who he wants to be. His father, of course, wants him to be a surgeon, follow in his footsteps, but be better than he ever was, but Kaladin has these dreams of going off to be a soldier to find glory, and these two things war within him, and that's something we continue to see quite a lot. Back in the main plot line, we see his leadership continue. He starts winning over the bridgemen, and these men are all broken in some way or another, and he's working on showing them there's still a reason to live, even though he struggled and will continue to struggle to find that reason himself many times. It's around this point that we also start to get the first hints of Kaladin being able to use Stormlight and see glimpses of him surge binding without knowing it. And so it's really an exciting time, because since we, the reader, had seen some flashes of this, of course, from Seth, we kind of know a little bit more what's going on, even though he's not sure. Part 2 started with the Cullens, though, and the end of this section does give a really big, nice ending for Dalinar, and it's with Dalinar really still questioning himself. He's been having the visions. He doesn't know if he's going insane or if they're real or not, or what to trust, and he's starting to not trust himself after Adolin questions him, and basically really it makes him think, should I step down? And he decides, yes, I'm going to abdicate. I'm going to have to do what's best for the kingdom, even if I do still kind of believe that these visions are true. And we're just left with this finality to the statement that he's going to abdicate. It's going to happen in days. And then we end part 2 right there. And it's just, once again, Sanderson doing such a great job of having real endings for each of the parts in the story. You really do feel like you're reading 4 different volumes in a story versus one big story in some ways, because there is the beginning, middle, and strong ending as well, which is just something that's really hard to do overall. So the next interludes include Risen, who really became later books, not necessarily in this one, became my favorite side character to read. Just the different things we get to see. She's apprenticing to a rather accomplished merchant, and he happens to be dealing with the Shin at the time. We get to see a new kind of Fabrial, some world building there, and then we learn a little bit more about the Shin culture, which we found very little out besides that we know Seth is Shin, but we don't really know a ton about his culture otherwise, so it is something that was really, really interesting to just see the glimpse of. We do have Axes, the Collector, on the other hand, while we get some world building, he studies Spren, tries to catalog and discover different kinds of Sprens, but he is said to be an Amian, and they are apparently this species on Rashar who look like humans but can change their body shape and have some powers that seem to be not connected with surge binding. And so this is something that we get very little information on. We see really glimpses of it in later books as well, but I'm wondering if this is going to be something that starts out something really important later, if we look at these people again. And last, of course, we have Seth, and here is where we start to see more of his skill as an assassin, get a closer look at what he can do as he's going through and completing missions for his most recent owner as well. Part 3 then opens up with Shallan, and the big thing I want to talk about here is Somatics and her conversation with Capsule the Arden. This seems rather innocuous, but actually contains so much information, world building, and foreshadowing. We see that put on a disc, some sand, and then playing a note on it with basically, like a violin bow, I guess is the word. The sand will actually move and form the shape of several of the world's kind of original cities, known as the Dawn cities at one time. And this right here does really have so much more to it, because we see how the Dawn cities and music and song and sound and patterns all play something huge into who the Dawn singers were and what the history was there. And that's something that doesn't really start to come out until way later, so kind of seeing how much is actually there, really, really impressive. After those Shallan passages, we get back to flashbacks of Kaladin and the crux of his soldier versus surgeon questioning. This is something that follows him throughout both his past and current arcs, and is very important to his character growth with deciding who he really is, and if you really can kill to protect, or if his father was right and there's no way to actually do that. These questions also parallel with what Shallan is going through with her own personal struggles of identity, and we see a lot more of her struggle in the next book, but the seeds of it are very much there in Way of Kings. We also start to see both of them muddling through using Stormlight, and giving that additional parallel I think really helps to bring Shallan's story together, because she has, the connection with Yasna, who is obviously a Kholin as well, so part of that royal family, but they're kind of off far away versus Adolin, Dalinar, Kaladin, they're all together, and so it kind of really pulls in, which I think was good to try to bring it together, and then it sets up it coming together in full in the next books. So with these things going on, we near the end of part 3, and we really get the climax for Shallan's arc up to this point, where she accidentally soulcasts, then feigns a suicide attempt to cover it up, is nearly killed in the crossfire by Capsule, who she thought was in love with her, while he's trying to poison Jasna, and then promptly has her wardship terminated. This brings Shallan to her lowest, most desperate place yet, and that's what echoed with the end of part 3 for Kaladin, where we finally get the full story of Amaran's betrayal, and we see that after Kaladin saved his life, took down a Shardbearer no less, and that Amaran still made him a slave because nobody would believe that he didn't want the shards. And so he kept him alive, spared his life, but sent him to be a slave, and we get that there. So we do leave on a pretty dark note here at the end of book 3, then jumping into the next set of interludes. And first we have Maxwell, and the focus here really seems to be introducing the Night Watcher and the old magic a bit deeper. We've had little hints at this and brief mentions, but not really learned a lot. So learning more about the old magic and how it works and what happens here does play in later to Dalinar's plotline. We find out that he went out and sought the old magic, and that's a really important plotline later as well. So this is just another thing, using the interludes to build the world a little more and set up really important things as well. We then have Gerenid, one half of a duo of Ardents that are in another far-off place on Roshar. She studies Spren, and he studies cooking, which, I mean, if you're going to study something, cooking doesn't sound half bad. You get to eat the results, as he points out. And this gives us yet another look into Spren, is kind of the big thing here, because they're studying them and kind of talking about how their nature is tied to the ideas of people, and that's a big idea that's explored a lot more in the next book as well. So once again, setting up something bigger here. And then we see, for me, what is the best scene for Seth yet, where we truly kind of see him be unleashed as he follows through on his assignment to kill the king of Jaq'Vet. We see deep into his tormented soul, he hates himself for what he does, and he hates those he sent to kill for not being able to stop him. And he's one of those characters that we really get the least information on overall, so this scene gives one of the deeper looks that we'll get for quite some time into him. We get a bit more in later books as well, and I know there will eventually be a book where he gets the flashbacks, and I very much look forward to that. I feel like that's going to be incredibly important to the series overall. But we've now gotten to part 4, so if you are still with me, hang on, we're almost till the end. I know this has already been pretty long. But with book 4, we see Kaladin slowly progressing with his Stormlight use and get a little bit more backstory on Teft and why he knows so much about the Radiants. And we've kind of seen a lot of different parts. We saw him at his lowest, getting better, and then we saw him become the wretch again and really have to be pulled out of it. So it's kind of that full circle, but now he seems to be on the up, and we have the feeling that he's going to stay there. We also get the reveal via Dalinar that the King's Wit is actually Hoid, the World Hopper, and start to see him actually involving himself in what's going on for the first time so far in Stormlight. This is also where it is so hard to read Dalinar having a conversation with High Prince Vama about manipulation and then promptly being manipulated by Sidious. Gets me every time. And I do want to take a moment here to talk through the epigraphs before I continue on. I haven't really talked about those so far, and they are actually really, really important. We start with quotes from those just before death, which is a nice big reveal at the end what those were, and then we get Hoyd's letter to another world hopper, and we also have excerpts from Jasna's research. And I'm just so dumbfounded every time I read this book how much foreshadowing and how many clues were included in the epigraphs. You can very much enjoy the story without looking at them deeply, but there are just so many points hinted at in them. It's really, really impressive how much of that was put in. We get all kinds of things hinted about the nature of Voidbringers, things that are going to happen later. There's a passage that tells us that Kaladin is going to end up joined with Dalinar in some way as well. All of these different things that are there in these very, very short passages, just once again very impressively done, and some of them that hint at things that we don't find out for one or two more books in general. Getting back to the story, though, we start to see some real growth from Adolin. And at the very beginning, like I said, let's be honest, he seems just spoiled. He really was more worried about court life than anything else. But we see him start to understand Dalinar and why he does the things that he does, why he lives by these codes, and understand that maybe living this way isn't a bad thing, and he feels like he does want to be better himself. And that was kind of nice because Adolin, I think, is supposed to be a character that we like, but he's pretty annoying for a lot of book one, and that continues to an extent. But it was nice to see growth there. And I do want to point out that it's around this time that we get a hint that Elhokar may become a Surgebinder, and he seems to be seeing something very similar to what Shallan sees, and we know that she is able to soulcast and has something going on here as well. So this little line about him seeing the patterns and the shapes watching him, which is really interesting how such a small, innocuous sounding thing, once again, really big implications for later books. We then get to Dalinar and freaking Sidious. Once again, it's just so hard to read knowing what's going to happen, and this is always the part where I just can't stop and have to keep going through even though I know what's going to happen because I just enjoy it so much. And just seeing the subtle manipulation into getting Dalinar to go on the run to the tower, the largest plateau, what will be the biggest army of Parshendi, without any of his own bridges, all just to betray him while having the excuse that he was forced to flee for safety. This scene of betrayal with Dalinar and Adolin fighting, not just for their wives, but for the wives of their men, knowing it's hopeless, but refusing to give up and try to flee without them. We see Dalinar really find clarity here at what he thinks is the end of his life, and he finally realizes that he wouldn't go back to the way he was, and he is okay with the changes that he's made. He feels like they're right, and even though him changing who he is, trying to be honorable and trust others, led him to this point, he still wouldn't go back and change it, and he's proud of who he is. And this was something really important because, like I said, we kept getting conflicting versions of who Dalinar was supposed to be. So we still don't know who he was, but we know this is who he's going to be going forward, and that's pretty definitively decided at this point. We see then Kaladin lead Bridge 4 to the rescue against Sidious' will, and instead of trying to flee, and this is also a big turning point for Kaladin. He says the second ideal, protecting those who cannot protect themselves. We see Syl as the honor spent she is, and we get the great climactic action sequence where Dalinar, Adolin, and the remnant of their army are rushing to get to the bridge, and Kaladin and the bridgemen are fighting them off, and Kaladin, of course, just casually takes down another shard bearer because no big deal, why not? And as great as the action there is, the final confrontation between Dalinar and Sidious still holds so much tension, and right there with you feel like, is it going to come to blows? They both said neither one of them could afford it, but is it going to come to blows? And instead, Dalinar, with his new I'm going to be honorable lifestyle, gives up his priceless shardblade, Oathbringer, in order to free not just Kaladin and his crew, but all the bridgemen in Sidious's war camp. And it's just such a great scene. It's a very powerful scene. And I won't lie, also seeing him kick the crap out of Elhokar, treating him like the child that he always acts like, was also very satisfying. But for different reasons, overall. And lastly, we get to part 5, which is by far the shortest part, but has some huge, impactful reveals. First, We get confirmation that both Jasmine and Shallan are able to soulcast without a soulcaster, instead using Surge Binding to do so, something that very much we were being led to, but it's kind of the first outright statement with it. And speaking of outright statements, we get the first time it's just stated that they now believe the Parshmen and or Parshendi are the remnants of what were the Voidbringers. The epigraphs hinted at this quite a lot throughout the story, but here's where it's kind of stated outright as well. We also see Dalinar getting into the final vision of this book, where he finds out that they are more like recordings, and this whole time he's not realized that he's being spoken to, not responded to at all. So being told what he thought was to trust Sidious was not. The same things were going to be said regardless. But the big thing here is he finds out God is dead. Now, for the Cosmere aware, we know a shard and God are a little bit different, but on the worlds, typically the shards are perceived as gods, and Honor was the Almighty, the most important figure in the Vorin religion, and finding out that your god is dead, what implications that have. He was defeated by this enemy Odium that he's now telling you have to fight. Huge implications, and just really shows you right away that the scale that we're going to hit is going to be so high in this series overall. Kind of like in Mistborn, where it really jumped up for book 3 especially. This is kind of setting up a little slower so that it's not so sudden, but really showing where the series is going to go. And finally, we circle back to the very beginning, the prelude where we learned that the Heralds would return as the desolation grew near, and we see the only one left in the Oath Pact, Tau, return to Roshar, with all that act entails. So this is the 4th time I've read this book through, and man, it's only gotten better to me. I absolutely love the book as a whole, if you couldn't tell from me talking about it, and I also consider Kaladin's arc to be one of the best in the series so far. I love reading it again, and I love the extra things you get out of this book every time you come back, knowing more about later events. It just has so much reread value, and even though it's a massive tome, it takes a lot of time, there's just so much more to get out of it every time. With that, however, I know this has been a very long video, so it's time to sign off. If you enjoyed the video, please feel free to give it a like, and if you want to see more content like this, including my videos for the later books in the series, then feel free to subscribe.